You have been lied to your entire life. You have lied to yourself your entire life. The story you've been telling yourself isn't the whole story. In fact, that's quite generous. It's not even close. And I can show you that. Close your eyes for a moment and think of one word that defines you. One word that defines you when things get difficult. Got it? Now, open your eyes. I have done the same thing and I have written mine down. Now, I want to ask you something. Where did that word come from? The theme of tonight is a world reframe, but before you can reframe your world, you have to deal with something a little more personal and much more uncomfortable. You have to deal with the frame that you have built for yourself. Psychologist Erik Erikson identified adolescence, roughly the years between 12 and 18, as the single most formative window for identity development in a human mind. Because that's when the brain is most actively constructing its working model of who you are. In other words, most of us are still haunted by the conclusions of a child who had no idea what they were building. Researchers studying autobiographical memory, the kind of memory that we use to identify our sense of self, have found that when people recall the experiences that made them who they are, they draw almost exclusively from what's called the reminiscence bump, a cluster of memories between ages 10 to 25 with the heaviest weight on teenage years. That means that we create our entire sense of self from nothing more than a handful of moments, from a period of time where our brain was still forming, from circumstances that we had almost no control over. A few years ago, when I was maybe 12, I was part of my school's competitive debating team, and we were having a practice session before one of our major competitions. Now, now that I think about it, I doubt that anyone was focused on anything but their own performance. However, I was knee-deep into my own research. I had written my arguments down, and they were good arguments, ones that I was proud of. I remember I used the words prefrontal cortex in there somewhere, so naturally I felt pretty good about myself. However, I was the second speaker, so I watched as the first speaker went up, my teammate, and stood proudly on the stage. Then, just as proudly, I watched as he took every single one of my ideas, arguments, and angles. And then, just like that, it was over. With a big smile on his face, he came down and sat next to me, looking at me like I had just bought him an ice cream with extra sprinkles. Raise your hands here if you know somebody like that. Unfortunately, if you're not raising your hand, you might be one of those people. However, the point is, this was one of my first times being second speaker, so naturally, I had less experience with improvisation. So when I got up there, I had practically nothing. I stumbled through it and it didn't look good. I could feel everybody's eyes melting through me. And that was the moment. It wasn't as though it was some disastrous event, despite it feeling as such at the time. But it was enough for the idea to start growing in my mind, the idea that maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. I know this thought would just come up whenever. It's And every time it came up, I was making it worse, each and every single time, without even realizing. I was taking a groove that already existed and I was pressing harder into it to the point where what happened felt like something that I was, rather than something that happened to me or something that I did. However, I kept showing up. And with that repetition, the changes became almost tangible. The brain that had once decided that maybe you're not good at this now had to sit there with building heaps of proof that said otherwise. But most people never actually get to this point, and that's because nobody ever actually explains to them what's going on when this happens. See, the thing is, every time you have a thought, it travels through a neural pathway, a physical connection between brain cells. And every single time that this thought fires, the connection gets stronger. Neuroscientists call this long-term potentiation, but the informal version is much simpler to understand. It's that neurons that fire together wire together. Essentially, that means that every time you replay a thought about yourself, absolutely any thought, then you are physically reinforcing the architecture that makes that thought easier to think again. A thought rehearsed enough times becomes a given. It only gets stranger, however. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has spent decades of her life studying human memory, specifically just how unreliable it actually is. Her research shows us that memory is not a recording. Every time that you remember something, you physically reconstruct that memory within your mind with whatever emotional state you're in that day. In one of her major studies, she found that changing one word in one of her questions, just one word, caused people to remember details that were never there to begin with. Genuine memories were constructed on the spot. And her conclusion, ultimately, was that memory is less retrieval and that it is more reconstruction. Who here has watched The Truman Show? Well, if you haven't, the basis of the plot is a man named Truman who lives in a TV show his entire life and never knows otherwise. But Truman Burbank never built the set he lived in. It was constructed around him without him ever knowing enough to question it. And it was constructed in such a way that he grew up and he never thought twice about it. And that is what Loftus is telling us about memory, that our story may only feel like our own because we've lived in it long enough. Think back to that word that you thought of at the start, and now think back to the moment that made you start using it to define yourself. How many times have you remembered that moment since it happened? 20 times, 100 times, 200 times? Because every single time you did, you have rebuilt that memory from scratch. In fact, that memory might not even be the same memory that you think it is anymore. So, ultimately, that is what Loftus tells us about the idea of memory. Now, the Innocence Project found that in wrongful conviction cases, almost 75% involved eyewitness misidentification. That means that people were imprisoned, some even put on death row, because somebody remembered something incorrectly. And this is the same fragile memory system that each of us relies on to shape our sense of self. Now, bear with me for a moment again and close your eyes. Imagine that you are walking across an open field with grass. You cross it, and the first time through, the grass resists a bit, but you make it to the other side. Second time, you walk through again, roughly the same path, and third time, the same. Now, by the 10th time, you start to notice that a faint path has started to form. Then, a year later, a clear, worn dirt path has formed. And it formed only because enough footsteps went in the same direction often enough. And that is exactly how your mind works. A thought rehearsed enough times becomes a given, And if you replay a thought about yourself enough times, then it starts to feel like the default route, the path of least resistance. It starts to feel natural, doesn't it? But really, it is just old. Now, in physics, there is a concept called inertia, where an object in motion stays in motion unless acted on by an outside force. And that is exactly how identity works. Michael Scott spends 7 seasons being told in explicit detail how he comes across. And he doesn't really change. And that's not because he's a stupid person, but rather it's because this version of himself that he has built, it's holding everything together. If you've been rehearsing a version of yourself for, say, 10 years, and you've been using it to determine what you're capable of before you have even tried, then that version of you has mass, real physical mass in your neural pathways. And when you try to change, even with genuine intention, it doesn't seem to work, does it? And that's because you're trying to stop something that's been in motion for a very long time using nothing but a single decision. And decisions, frankly, are not enough force. Last week I decided to get a haircut. Look at me now. Now, a plane that changes its heading by just 5 degrees at takeoff lands in a completely different country. In fact, if a plane took off from here and they traveled 10,000 kilometers northeast, they would land in Japan. 5 degrees more north, and they would end up in Russia. In Formula One, 200ths of a second can determine whether you are pole position or P10. And that ultimately is what matters. These small decisions, these small details, they accumulate over time. You may not notice it at the beginning, but over time, these effects become far clearer over time and over distance. And that is how behavioral change actually works. Researcher Philippa Lally at University College London tracked 96 people attempting to build habits, and she found that the point to reach genuine automacy, the point where a behavior happens without any conscious mental effort, is between 18 to 254 days, with an average of 66. But now, what this highlights for us is that motivation is not enough to keep us going. Change is slower than the motivation that starts it. And it always will be so. Now, you have been in a trial your entire lives. You have been repeating the same trial for many years, same witness that you've been coaching, the same testimony that you've been writing, and every year you wonder why the jury never acquits you. LeBron, surprisingly, is one of the most scrutinized athletes on the planet. Every year, for the last 20 years, somebody has declared him washed, somebody has declared him declining. But he has outlasted every single one of those verdicts. And every single year, he submits a new and different season. He submits new and different evidence. Now, the question is, with everything that I've told you, what do you actually do? What do you do with all of this? Well, as I said, you have been living in a trial for many years. Same trial, many years, same witness, same evidence, same outcome. In fact, how many people here have already decided what they're capable of? Well, you do not need to start a case from scratch, and you don't hopefully need to burn the courthouse down. All you need to do is submit different evidence. One piece, something that's small, something that's recent, a moment where you have acted differently than what you're used to. Because that's all the defense needs to create reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt in a trial that has been running unopposed for years is everything. Do it again. Submit another piece of evidence, then another, until the brain and the jury has no choice but to reconsider. One conversation that you have instead of avoid, one attempt that you make instead of talking yourself out of, it hardly ever feels like it'll change anything for you. Nobody is going to pull you aside afterwards and share their acknowledgement, but the brain is watching. The brain is always watching, and it's always remembering. Identity, ultimately, is a current that's shaped by whatever flows through it. You are not a fixed thing. You are a system, a living, physical, malleable system that responds to whatever you feed it directly. Humans are tapestries of what they've come to love and experience. And your identity, that word that you thought of at the start, it's not fixed. It doesn't have to be you, it's just the repetition. And you are capable of redirecting that repetition. It's not going to feel significant when it happens. In fact, it's not going to feel like anything at all. But in your mind, a new groove is being pressed. A new path is gaining its first footsteps. And one day, you'll look back and you'll realize that the old path has grass growing back over it. Think back to that word at the start. Is it still really you? My name is Armahan Siddiqui, and it has been a pleasure to talk to you all tonight. Your story feels permanent because you've been reading the same page for too long. Reframe it. Write something new.